Good evening, everyone. My name is Salim Chapman, and I am the Legislative Coordinator for Move to Amend. It's 8:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started for this evening. Thank you for joining this month's webinar on how to support the We the People Amendment in Congress. So before we get started, let's check to make sure that everyone can participate fully. By now, you should be hearing audio. You're able to listen to this webinar through your computer speakers or via the phone. The dial-in information is listed on the screen. If you have any questions as we proceed through the presentation tonight, it's best to type those into the chat bar at the bottom of your screen. And in case you miss anything or would like to share the information we talk about with others, it's important to know that we are recording this evening's webinar, and we will follow up and email it to registrants. So don't worry about taking furious notes, because you will be able to go back after the fact and rewatch this if needed. So let's review our agenda for this evening. First, we'll start with a brief overview of Move to Amend. From there, we'll transition into a discussion of grassroots strategies for engaging Congress. Then we'll discuss how to effectively communicate with Congress, followed by a quick Q&A. And lastly, we'll conclude our program with a conversation about next steps. So what is Move to Amend and why does it exist? Move to Amend is a coalition of 100 of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals committed to this idea of social and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that is genuinely accountable to the people and not corporate interests. And we sort of are trying to actualize that vision by doing two things. Passing the We the People Amendment that makes clear that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights and that money is not speech, as well as to provoke a discussion and organizing about how to make real the promise of democracy through constitutional renewal. Our work is oriented around 5 principles and values. The first being anti-oppression and solidarity organizing. The second being coalition and movement building, grassroots organizing, dedication to political education, and political and economic independence. All these values are grounded within everything we do and acts as our North Star in every decision and action that we decide to do as an organization. Move to Amend coalition structure, we're guided by a national board, which is then a national team, including myself, oversees day-to-day operations in addition to offering support and facilitating connections to local affiliates. Local affiliates sit at the core of our organization, carrying out the on-the-ground organizing and coalition building that is central to the mission that we've already talked about this evening. Similar in purpose, but a little slightly less formal in structure, are the We the People Amendment working groups. These are ad hoc groups organized in specific cities or towns to support the efforts to pass the We the People Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In addition to those groups, a host of organizational partners and independent supporters round out our coalition. So, it's important to know how essential the We the People Amendment is at this matter in time. Corporations have hijacked our constitutions and are working with the judiciary to use it against us. And even as we've seen more progressive ideas emerge in Congress recently, it's important to know that Green New Deal, Medicare for All, HR 1, environmental policies, consumer protections, worker protections, all these things require addressing corporate constitutional rights, because even if they were enacted through Congress, the likelihood is that the next day there will be lawsuits filed that will eventually go to Supreme Court, and we will likely find ourselves in the same place. So it's important to remember that we need to sort of not address the symptom, but the actual disease that is leading to some of the problems that we're seeing in our democracy right now. So with that being said, this is a constitutional and a democratic crisis. It's not simply a money and politics crisis. And so, you know, thinking back to 2009 or 2008 or 2007, it's important to realize that our democracy wasn't functioning as intended then. And so to simply overturn Citizens United isn't going far enough, and that we need a more comprehensive solution to really address some of the issues that we're seeing. And for us, we really believe this idea of corporate power and corporate constitutional rights is really where the root cause of these issues lie. So let's get into the meat of our programming tonight with sort of starting to talk about grassroots strategies for engaging Congress. There are several strategies grassroots activists can employ to engage with Congress. This evening, we'll dive into 4 of those strategies. The first being phone calls. Picking up the phone is a very effective way to engage. In-person meetings, face-to-face contact are always very important in terms of influencing decisions that members of Congress are making. Organize a grassroots demonstration, another effective grassroots tactic. And BirdDogging at town hall events and other public events is a really great way of moving members of Congress to exercise leadership on a particular issue and hold them accountable for their positions. Although we won't have time to cover it tonight, I do want to mention that writing letters to the editor or op-eds are another great way to share your position on an issue with a member of Congress. And so while we won't have time to sort of dive into that tactic, I do encourage folks to sort of explore that when they're thinking about strategies that they can employ to help us move and advance this issue. So why should you call and not email? This is a common question that I often get. And it's important to realize that constituent calls are logged and tracked. So even if you don't speak directly to the lawmaker, your message will ultimately get passed to them in some form. And so it's important to know, though, that when you are thinking about making these calls, that there is strength in numbers. The speed at which it ultimately reached the desk of that member of Congress is likely to depend on how many calls that are received at any given or particular time, as well as how you think about presenting your story. And we've seen in a number of occasions that a large volume of calls have the ability to bring offices to halts and will sort of spur them to action to actually respond to an issue at a pace that they likely wouldn't if only 1 or 2 people call. So when you're thinking about doing a phone banking event, really try to spread the word and get as many people to engage as possible, because this will likely amplify the impact. I don't want to discourage folks from callings as individuals. I think that's important. But if you really have the opportunity to build momentum and to get a lot of people to do it at one particular time, you'll see an even and greater multiplier effect as a result of that effort. So think about sort of finding others to engage in that practice with you when you decide to do it. All right, so face-to-face visits with members of Congress, there are a couple of things to remember. These are very effective ways to educate elected officials and their staff. Very impactful, and I'll show later how impactful these are in comparison to some other practices that have been reviewed and surveyed. On this slide, we'll review some of the best practices for scheduling a meeting with a congressional office. The first step is to get to know the scheduler. The scheduler is typically the only staff member that can schedule a meeting for a member of Congress. And so the best way, and often the easiest way, to get this information is to phone the office and request their name and email. Once you have that information, think about submitting a meeting requests with significant lead time. So we've seen that 3 to 4 weeks in advance of a proposed visit date is sort of the ideal time frame to submit your formal request. And you may want to prepare yourself to submit that request multiple times. Congressional offices receive many maroon requests on a daily basis, and oftentimes communications gets directed to the wrong person. And so in your follow-up, be prepared to do some follow-up. And if you're in your follow-up that the scheduler cannot locate your request, do not panic. Just calmly suggest how they will like you to send that request again. When you are communicating with a scheduler, even whether it's your first request for the meeting or any follow-up, it's important to have all the information that is needed available. So most schedulers will require at least the following when scheduling the meeting. They want to know the topic or reason for the meeting. So in this case, you will want to discuss the We the People Amendment. And if you're meeting with a member of the House of Representatives, you can sort of direct them to its House Joint Resolution 48. You want to give them the primary contact number. Particularly, this is important if you are going in a group, and we'll talk a little bit soon about why that's important. But if you are going in a group, you want to designate one primary contact person and give their information. You want to give a name, a short description of the group. So in this case, you want to say that you're a representative from the Move to Amend Coalition, and talk a little bit about how we are a broad-based coalition made up of hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals. You want to submit your requested meeting date, as well as, again, that contact information for the primary person. So that email address or phone number. So you get the meeting, you're there, what do? So the first step is, let's review some of these best practices. One thing I always tell folks is that you likely are going to get a meeting with a staffer, and that's not a bad thing. Staff contacts have many advantages. In many ways, working with congressional staff can actually be much more effective than working with the member themselves, because staff can take a little bit more time to delve into the issue and gain a greater understanding of why the idea you're proposing is such a great one, in a way that the member of Congress probably won't. And so with a little work on your part, you can really cultivate staff members to become an advocate within a congressional office for your cause. And so it's really a strategic opportunity, not necessarily something to be disappointed by if you get a meeting with a staffer rather than the actual member themselves. But once you get there, you want to make sure that you stay on topic. It's easy when you are getting a meeting with a congressional office to sort of want to address multiple issues that might be top of mind for you and really critical. But I really do think it's important to limit the focus of the meeting and to concentrate on the goal at hand. So in this case, if you're sort of helping advance and support and advocate for the We the People Amendment, to make sure that you focus and be clear about that particular idea, and to make a clear focus and persuasive case as to why the legislature should take up that issue. The other thing I would say is that, if things go well, you should be getting questions. It should be a dialogue. And if you do get a question and you do not know the answer to that question, it's okay. I think it's sometimes hard to be comfortable with not knowing, but I think that's something that is really important to remember when you are going into a congressional meeting. Don't worry if you're asked a question that you don't know. Just tell the staffer that you'll get back with them, and use the question as a talking point for follow-up. I think, we'll discuss a little bit more tonight about the importance of follow-up, and I think any sort of angle you can use to have a reason to email them and to make sure you're saying top of mind, or to call them, you want to take advantage of that. And I do think that questions that you do not have the answer to is a really good way of finding an end to make that follow-up attempt. So you also want to bring along a brief summary document. I think, the advocacy doesn't have to stop when you leave that office, right? You want to have something to leave behind. And so Move to Amend actually has several resources that are already prepared and available for this. We'll provide you with everything you need to construct an effective lobby packet. But just remember that it's important to make sure that you have a document probably no longer than probably 1 to 2, at most 3 pages, something that's really easy digestible for the staffer and that they can reference pretty quickly to relay information to their bosses when needed. So I alluded to you before about how important in-person meetings and face-to-face interactions can be. And what you see in this figure here are results from a survey of congressional staff by the Congressional Management Foundation. And what it shows that our visits to offices, in-person meetings, whether it's in the DC office or the district office, has a lot of influence on undecided members. As you can see, is ranked at the top of this chart. So it matters, and I think that this is a tactic that can be employed with other tactics, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But really, this is a very high value or low effort, high value tactic to employ having an in-person meeting with a member of Congress. So let's talk a little bit about grassroots demonstrations. These are an excellent tool for applying community pressure and demonstrating your organizing power. Oftentimes a great place to host these are outside of the office of a member of Congress. And one thing that I saw in Pennsylvania, where I live, just after the 2016 election, was some organizers organized this series of grassroots actions called Tuesday with Toomey. Pat Toomey is one of our senators here, and he's not necessarily very favorable to a lot of issues that I personally care about, and I think others who attended that demonstration personally cared about. And so they would go there every Tuesday during the lunch hour to hold a demonstration outside of his office. And I think it was a really, really great tool, and it ultimately resulted in him hosting a town hall meeting, which he had been very reluctant to do prior to that activism. So I do think it's important that when you are organizing a grassroots demonstration that you invite others to speak about how corporate rule impacts their fronts of the struggle, right? I think this is something that goes back to our values that I talked about at sort of the beginning of this program, that this practice of solidarity organizing keeps us true to our values of not acting or speaking on behalf of others, but taking action in unity. And so I really sort of encourage you to use this as an opportunity to reach out and to build relationships with other organizations who could be allies in this fight. I was just saying before about pairing a meeting with another tactic, and so grassroots demonstrations are a great one to pair with face-to-face meetings with congressional offices. In this case, you want to appoint sort of a small subset of the group who's doing the demonstration to go and conduct a meeting and come back. But this is a really good opportunity to, maximize those attempts. So if you're already sort of going through the effort of organizing a grassroots demonstration, there's probably only a few other steps to schedule a meeting and sort of have that be a more even high value opportunity. So I do encourage you that if you are organizing a grassroots demonstration, to really think about doing it close to where your member of Congress offices are, as well as to pair that with a meeting with them towards the end of the demonstration. And what we've know, if you've ever participated in a grassroots demonstration, that these are really good at building momentum and excitement. I think it's a really great organizing tool. These are very high visible opportunities, and they're really good at sort of gaining people's attention and making them want to sort of be more curious and to investigate more about the work that you're doing, and maybe to stop by and ask questions, or to read some of the material that you might have out there. So these are really, really good, not just for advocacy and activism, but also as organizing. And so I do think that that's sort of the what makes grassroots demonstrations really a high value tactic, because sort of you're getting values on different fronts. So if you're eager to sort of roll up your sleeves and get started putting this knowledge into practice, I would encourage you to consider joining us in Move to Men's upcoming National Day of Action to free the people from corporate rule on May 28th. Here we'll be targeting members of Congress all across the country as a show of power. And so I do really think that this is a really good opportunity to begin doing exactly what I was just describing probably for the last 3 minutes. Is what we're encouraging folks to do is to organize a grassroots demonstration where they are asking allied organizations to come out and speak about this issue, as well as to pair it with a meeting with their member of Congress. And so the nice thing about this, if you really are interested in doing grassroots demonstration, is that there's a support structure set up to really help get you there. This Free to People action will have a series of webinars and resources that are already available online to sort of help get you started. So if this is something that you've been really thinking about doing or have done before but haven't done in some time, I think that participating in this May 28th action is a really good way to sort of get yourself started with this particular tactic again. So I want to talk a little bit about town halls and bird dogging. So showing up matters. I can't say it any more simpler than that. Members of Congress often host these town hall meetings to hear from constituents, most often during congressional recesses. And attending these town halls are really an excellent way to thank your member in public for a positive action that they've taken, or to call them out on a particular issue. And so, you know, when you go on BirdDog, you're really seeking out that member of Congress or legislator, and you want to pin them down on an issue with specific questions and sort of retrieve their views on that. So, and what we found is that BirdDogging has a lot of advantages as a tactic, because it, one, elevates our issue in the media and to the public. It provides a really good opportunity to educate elected officials about our issue. And if you're able to record your response, it's a really good way of holding them accountable to the position. So one thing that we've always encouraged folks to do is, one, to go and do these opportunities in a group. And two, when you do go and do it in a group, to designate somebody to be a videographer, so that any response that you get, you have documented and recorded, and can use that as a tool to really hold that elected official accountable for whatever response they give you. So what are your keys to success here for being successful at BirdDogging? Well, you want to find out where your member of Congress plans to be. So a good place for that is to monitor campaign websites and email lists. You can call the office as well as check local media sources. Again, this is a thing where it's best to have strength in numbers. So having a group of advocates who will attend, I think, has two positive effects. I think the first one being is that it will minimize any intimidation that you might feel, as well as increase the odds that you're able to ask a question, because there's going to be many people there likely wanting to ask questions of their own. And so the more folks you have who are going to pose the question key to this issue, the better. I do think it's important to plan and practice your strategy, right? I think writing down your questions is another way, again, to sort of minimize that intimidation and to make sure that you're clear about what it is that you want to get across to the elected official in the event that you do feel a little bit of jitters around that. The next tip I would say is that get a good seat. Get as close to the policymaker as you possibly can, and you want to spread out, right? So again, we talked a little bit about increasing your odds. I think if you go as a group, you want to make sure that you guys sort of disperse in the room, because I think as the elected official is surveying a room to ask questions, the more folks you have sort of spread out, the better are your chances of getting picked. Putting your hand up first is really critical to getting called during the Q&A session. So you probably even want to do this before, slightly before they opened up the Q&A period. And then even if you don't have the opportunity to get your question answered during the Q&A, handshake lines and those photo opportunities are a really good way to present that question to the member of Congress and get them on a record even after the Q&A period. And then once all that's done, you want to make sure to get quoted, right? You want to speak to the press with statements that you prepared. So going back to sort of that practice in advance sort of thing, making sure that you have a clear sense of what you want the press to walk away with, and you want to give them that statement and of how you will like your member of Congress to exercise leadership. So those are sort of the key steps that we found in terms of successful bird dogging. And if you're really interested in this as a tactic, June's Take Action webinar will actually focus pretty extensively on this. So hopefully this whetted your appetite a little bit and you'll come back to learn more in June. All right, so we're going to pivot our conversation a little bit and shift from the review of the tactics to really thinking a little bit about how do we communicate effectively with members of Congress. And so no matter the approach that you pursue, the engagement process pretty much follows the same sort of cycle, right? I think you want to start with preparation. So we talked a little bit about that in our conversation around bird dogging. Then you want a message that really connects and resonates with either the staffer or the member of Congress. You want to make sure that you're providing education and knowledge sharing on the issue that you are advocating about. And then you want to make sure to have a clear and concise ask, as well as do that follow-up. So we talked a little bit earlier about using those questions that you may not have an answer to as an angle to do that follow-up. And so, as I said then, that this is a critical piece of the puzzle. And so you should always sort of be thinking about in those conversations, what are sort of ways you can use to think about following up with those folks and to make sure you're staying top of mind. The other thing I just want to point out here is that this process is iterative, right? So the cycle engagement continues and is intended to sort of be refined over time. It isn't sort of just a linear process, but something that you continue to do. So that follow-up hopefully will lead into another meeting or another grassroots demonstration or another sort of series of phone calls, and you'll sort of be following through that cycle once again. So let's dive a little bit more in here to one of these strategies. And successful advocacy starts with preparation. And in this context, you really want to get to know your representative. And the best way to do this is to do some solid background research. And I have a few questions here that can really guide you in that exploration. So one of the things that you may want to really think about when you are doing background research in a meeting around the We the People Amendment is, has the candidate taken our pledge to amend? So pledge to amend is a pledge that we have candidates for office take when they're running for office, that's basically asking them to use their elected position to advance this idea of ending corporate constitutional rights and getting money out of speech. And so that's oftentimes a really good way of holding them accountable to that pledge, is to immediately say, hey, you've taken this pledge, now you should consider co-sponsoring the We the People Amendment in Congress, is one tactic that we've often used. So for For those who've been in the Congress a little bit longer, you want to think about, have they sponsored the amendment in the past? Who do they take money from? So what are some of the reasons underlying their decision to not possibly have co-sponsored previously? What type of legislation do they support? And so is there some nexus between corporate rule and sort of the pattern of legislation that they've been supporting? You know, I think we've seen a lot of this around those who've taken money from the fossil fuel industry and how that sort of translates into how they vote on environmental issues. And so I think that nexus can be sort of found on multiple different fronts. And so I think it's really important to think about both where their money's coming from, as well as the type of legislation that they support. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here because I cannot stress enough that communicating with a representative can really hinge on contacting the right staff person. So I think it's really important to have a clear understanding of the staff and their roles. And so we talked a little bit earlier when we were thinking about how to schedule a meeting and how important it was to know who the scheduler was and know that they were the only folks who can schedule a meeting with a member of Congress. So now we're going to sort of talk a little bit about some of the other roles that you'll see in a congressional office and how they differ depending on whether or not you are talking to the district or state office or the DC office. So the district office is really the first point of contact for most constituents. The work of the district's offices normally revolve mostly around local issues. Whereas on the other hand, the Washington, D.C. staff are sort of less focused on casework and local issues and more focused on the legislative stuff. So, and you'll see that the responsibilities of the jobs that are within these offices sort of reflects this difference. So starting with caseworkers sort of spend most of their time solving the problems constituents encounter with federal government. So these individuals are normally very adept at maneuvering and navigating the maze of the federal bureaucracy. The district scheduler, so again, these are the folks who normally have oversight over the member's time when he or she is in the district or the state. Field representatives, these are normally folks that if you want to meet with a district staff person to discuss a particular local issue, or you want to invite someone to a local event or meeting, you likely want to ask the field representative who handles that issue. So oftentimes on this particular issue, that'll likely be someone who covers campaign finance or judiciary issues. Field representatives can also talk to you about federal issues that directly affects your district or actions of federal agencies that has an effect on local people. And so their job is really to be the ears on the ground for the member of Congress in the district and really understand both how local issues and local perspectives should help influence DC legislation, as well as the outcomes of DC legislation and how that translates back at the district scale. And so with the district staff / office director sort of oversees all the operations for the district office, and they're often the point person on sort of highly sensitive local political issues. So constituencies are asked for this person if they really feel concerned that their needs are not being met by others in the office. And I do find that it's really good to build relationships with these individuals. Again, I think they are often the go-to advisors for the member of Congress on local issues. And so I do think that the more of a relationship you have with them and the more you can sort of cultivate them into the ally, the better off you're going to be in terms of ensuring that your issue gets the needed attention it should by the member of Congress. So shifting to the DC staff, oftentimes they'll have a staff assistant The role of staff assistant is generally to handle front desk duties, which can include answering phones, greeting visitors, sorting mail. And in these offices, sometimes they will handle some policy issues as well. The DC scheduler, so this is normally the individual who controls the member's time when he or she is in DC. And so if you're planning on coming to DC for a meeting, which many of you will during our lobby day, during the last day of the leadership summit, in the process leading up to that and scheduling your meetings, you'll be contacting the DC scheduler to do that. Legislative assistants. These folks are normally the people who handle the bulk of the policy work in congressional office. So if you want to really dive deep into an issue, the legislative assistant is likely the person you want to speak to. And again, similarly with the field representative, in the context of the We the People Amendment, these are likely going to be folks who cover campaign finance or judiciary issues. So the legislative director, this is the person who sort of oversees all of the legislative staff and handles a lot of sort of the policy issues that the office deals with. They're supported by legislative correspondents who are generally responsible for drafting letters in response to constituent comments and concerns, as well as sort of having oversight over a few legislative issues. So if you ever sort of have submitted a letter to your representative and gotten a response, likely that response was read in by a legislative correspondent. And then communications directors / spokespeople / press secretaries. These folks are generally responsible for fielding calls from the media, as well as sort of representing and being the primary voice for the office and speaking on behalf of the member of Congress. So that sort of wraps up our conversation of the different staff roles. So I think sort of the important thing to remember here is that there are quite a few different roles, and to make sure that you're talking to the right person about the right thing. And I want to reiterate sort of the point I said before about getting a meeting with staff and advantages of this. I think it can easily, you hear that you're having a meeting with a legislative assistant, and you can think of that, oh, well, that's not that great. I'm probably meeting with someone who's sort of a more junior level staff, and how is this actually going to achieve results? But sort of as I said before, these are the folks who handle the bulk of the policy work. And so in some ways, really engaging and having a deep conversation with the legislative assistant can oftentimes be a more productive conversation and advocacy effort than actually talking to the member themselves or the legislative director, who oftentimes are handling a broad portfolio of issues and likely aren't really have enough knowledge base to understand the nuances of what you're going to be trying to convey in your meeting. So don't get too disappointed if you do end up meeting with legislative assistants and then really realize that despite their title, they actually carry a lot of influence. So when you're developing a compelling message to share with a member of Congress, you really want to concentrate on something that's local and relevant. You want to develop your pitch around the impact of how corporate rule and corporate power are impacting your state or your district. So, we talked a little bit about this. If you're sort of engaging with the district office and you are talking to a field representative, these are the folks who, again, they're tasked with keeping abreast of where things are with the district and how sort of the nexus between policy is interacting with the district. And so you want to make sure that your message to them, but even to others in the office as well, is really conveying a constituent perspective and really sharing about how you think that particular policy and corporate role specifically is sort of hindering the well-being of your area. Then you want to state your position. You want to provide some pretty well-grounded reasons as to why you support the We the People Amendment, and I really think it's important here to really include a personal touch. When you're sort of giving your argument, you want to share relevant and personal stories about how corporate rule has affected you. So maybe you live in a place where you don't have access to healthy and affordable drinking water, and likely that's a byproduct of where our environmental policy and regulations stand, and often that's connected to what we see to corporations and their ability to sort of evade environmental regulations. Or maybe someone who has been incarcerated, and likely that has been an influence around the growth of for-profit prisons. So there are a lot of sort of these nexuses that you can create, and so I really think it's important to share a personal story from your perspective about how corporate rule has affected you. So here are some reflective questions that I found helpful and that I wanted to share to guide you in developing a strong message. So some qualities of a strong message include, does it create an emotional reaction? When you hear it, does it makes that person sort of, have a visceral feeling to it? Is it truthful and easily understood? Is it sort of concise and really able to convey your point in a really clear way? Does it create mental image? So I think that's where sort of the personal story comes in really well, because I think it's a really good way of folks sort of having something very tangible to connect to. Some of these issues can be rather theoretical, and so I think having something that is very concrete to sort of help ground what that impact is often really effective. Will people retain and want to repeat it? So I think what we've seen recently, particularly with messaging around progressive ideas such as like the Green New Deal and Medicare for All, sort of these short bits of information that's very easily to sort of convey an idea, I think are really sort of what I think of strong messaging, right? I think they do all of these things. They have an emotional reaction. You understand generally what it's about just by hearing it, even if you don't understand all the specific details about it. It creates a mental image for you in terms of what it connotates, right? So if you think of Medicare for All, you think of some form of sort of broad access to health insurance. It's, again, very easily to repeat. And I think what we've seen, and I don't think very few would debate, is that it has done a really good job of inspiring people to act. So it doesn't have to be something that is well sort of nuanced or very complex to be a message that can be very strong. And so just those sort of short phrases, 4 or 5 words, can really do the job if it's crafted appropriately. So we want to talk a little bit about the ask, sort of our next stage in the cycle. And so here, educate. You want to share your knowledge and influence. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So here, I really think what you want to do is empower your expertise. I think an important aspect to building a relationship with a member of Congress is to offer your knowledge and your counsel, so they share your opinion and really give weight to what you say. I think a good way of framing this idea is that you want to be the go-to person that they seek out when they want to have information or have a conversation around corporate power and corporate constitutional rights. And then I also think it's important to state your power, right? Do you have influence over a key portions of the community or a constituency base? If that's the case, I think you want to tell them. I think it's important to make them know, to make them understand that you represent larger than just your individual self, and that depending on how they act on a particular issue could have broad ramifications. So now we'll talk a little bit about the ask. So when you want to, what you should be asking your member of Congress to do in support of the We the People Amendment are 2 things. Either you're going to ask them to co-sponsor the We the People Amendment, and since we are focusing right now primarily on members in the House of Representatives, you want to ask them to co-sponsor House Joint Resolution 48, or sort of the shorter version of that is HJR 48. And if they're already a co-sponsor, what we're really hoping you'll do is to urge them to press others in your state congressional delegation to co-sponsor as well. It's been, I cannot tell you how much of value it is if we can get all congressional members from a particular state to co-sponsor, particularly as we're working diligently to get the amendment introduced in the Senate. I think that goes a long way in terms of convincing senators of how they should proceed if there's sort of broad support from the House of Representatives from their state to take a particular action. So follow-up, I think we covered this a little bit, but to dive a little bit more into the details, you want to thank them for their time. So a way of doing this is to share a thank you note to the staff shortly after your meeting, and be sure to respond to any questions that you can answer in the meeting, and to provide any follow-up information as needed. So we've talked about this a couple of times, that really using those unanswered questions as an opportunity to really engage in some really key follow-up is really important. It's important that you follow through on those things if you say you'll get back to them with additional information. And sort of building off of this last point around stating your power, I do think you want to continue to showcase your organizing. Periodically follow up and share updates, whether it's through social media, emails, or in-person meetings, about the grassroots organizing you're doing in the area, and how you'll respond accordingly depending on how your member of Congress decides to act on a particular issue. So I know we've covered quite a bit tonight, but so I wanted to now open it up for questions. So again, if you have any questions, the best way to do it is to type it in the Q&A box, chat box towards the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get those answered for you. So I'm not seeing any questions here, unless I'm not looking in the right place. Give me 1 second. So, okay. Trying to. Technology, sorry, bear with me for 1 more second. Okay. All right, so we have some questions coming in. One of the questions that we have is, will the Leadership Summit attendees be organizing their own meetings in Washington, D.C.? Yes, so we will be following up with more information in terms of how to do that. But attendees to leadership will be scheduling their own meetings, and we have a ton of scripts, both email and phone scripts, to support you in doing that. And there will be some other guidance as to how to do that. And that will probably be coming out, I would imagine, sometime early next month. But again, yes, meetings, those who are attending the Leadership Summit will be scheduling their own meetings. All right. The other question is, would you restate where to find information you covered tonight on the Move to Amend website? So If you go to the website and you search Take Action Webinars, you'll be taken to the page that lists all the webinars that we have previously recorded. Also, the way to do that, which be to just search the name of this particular presentation, which is how to engage with members of Congress on the We the People Amendment. But also, it's important to know that we will email this presentation to you directly. So if you are a registrant for this program tonight, if you signed up for it, you will get an email containing a recording to this presentation. So the next question we have is to describe the May 28th event in a bit more detail. So we will actually just talk about this a little bit more in the next slide here. Let me see if I can get to it for us. So if you visit move2amend /free the people, you will find more information about the National Day of Actions. And there's actually another webinar coming up, I believe it's next week, which is, I talked a little bit about, there was these support structure and webinars and resources set up to sort of guide folks in participating. And so this will be the opportunity to do so. But the easiest way to get started immediately is to visit that website, which is move2amend.org /free the people. And it'll contain all the information you need about how to get started. All right, we have one more question here. So get colleges to use legislative telecom meetings for local communities with every political science group and civil rights organization in that group. So I think Lynn's point here is more of a sort of feedback and advice for the group that colleges are in local community groups and political science groups are a really good way of engaging as well. If I'm not addressing your point, Lynn, or conveying it well, please correct me. But I think what you were offering was more advice to the group. So those are all the questions that I am seeing at this time. If you have any other questions, please continue to type those in, and I'll do one last sort of round of answers before we close up here after I go through the next steps. So as I said before, if you want to find out more information about the National Day of Actions, you want to visit the URL on the screen, which is move2amend.org /free the people. I encourage you to participate in the next two Take Action webinars that are coming up, both on May the 7th and June the 4th. June the 4th, again, is that webinar on BirdDogging. So if you were really interested on some of the things you heard about the usefulness and value of doing BirdDogging in tonight's presentation, I encourage you to join the June 4th webinar so you can dive in a little bit more deeper in terms of best practices for doing that. I do encourage you to register for the Leadership Summit. So it sounds like some folks are already very eager to do so, and talking about how we'll participate in the lobby day. I do really think it's a really, really awesome opportunity. I attended my first Leadership Summit last year, and it was really transformative for me in terms of both all the peer learning that I was able to have, as well as have an opportunity to do the lobby day. It was a really powerful experience. And so hope you don't miss it. And then continue to let us know if you have any questions. We'll try to get those answered as quickly as we can. All right, so I have a few more questions here that I'll tend to answer before we wrap up. So one question I have here, are you familiar with taxation of every Wall Street transaction? I am not. I am not familiar with that particular idea. So if there's a little bit more context in terms of how that information would be useful, or where I could find that, I would be happy to do it and to maybe do some research. But I am not familiar with that particular issue. All right. So the next question we have here is, we are trying to get younger people involved, and we'll be tabling at all our local community colleges, educating and gathering signatures. They have free speech areas. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good place to get started, and not to continue to make a shameless plug, but I really do think, we talked a little bit earlier about the energy and momentum that the grassroots demonstrations can have. And so I really would encourage you to plan one in your area, and maybe to use that as a very concrete way of having a next step for those young folks to get involved, because there's a lot of energy we've seen from young people to sort of do demonstrations and have activism. And so maybe having sort of an immediate opportunity for them to get involved would be a really good way, I think, of continuing that involvement and making sure it's sustainable over the long term. All right. Great. So I have another comment here that Representative Peter DeFazio of Oregon. Seems like the Oregon Democrats are working on it and have been for years. So that's good to hear. The more sort of co-sponsors we have, the better. Our goal this year is 75, I believe, in the House. I could be underselling that, but we have a little bit of ways to go before we get there. So the more folks we can have, the better. I'm not seeing any more questions here, so I hope that that means that this was a very informative and clearly presented program this evening. Just to quickly, again, go over the next steps. I really, once again, would encourage people to visit the website and to learn more about the May 28th action. Please continue to come and participate in these webinars. I hope that you find them valuable. I cannot say enough about the value of attending the Leadership Summit, so I would encourage you to register for that, and then URL is also on the screen, and continue to let us know if you have any questions outside of this, to reach out to us, and we'll happily assist you with that. I mean, as I said before, that is what the national team is here to do. So I want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and have a good night.